I'm delighted to be here. Such a great company and being part of such a fantastic symposium. I think it's particularly appropriate that I'm following both Rich's and Herb's talks because it draws directly on their work, on the ideas they're presenting, and in Rich's case, directly on his work. And so I think that the way he's discussed it and set it up actually works really, really well for what I have to say. So what I would say is really what I found interesting is there's a motivation to consider data as a separate consideration in antitrust. So first is a merger doctrine has been suggested that we need to think not just about mergers in terms of product markets, but in terms of aggregations of data. And in fact, I see that Alden Abed is here. When he was general counsel of the FTC, he had a colloquy with one of his colleagues in the FTC about whether this was a good idea. And you see this actually going past that dialogue within the FTC to a reference as one of the examples in Guideline 9 of the current merger doctrine, merger guidelines, of really taking that into account. But beyond the merger context is an interesting question of whether we should consider aggregations of data as a potential source of monopolization. And this came up most clearly in the Google case, the notion that companies that, for example, to the extent to which data searches generated by past data on past searches, the availability of access to that data and the scale of itself can create entry barriers or give people dominant or potential sources of dominance based on how that would go as purely, therefore, and creates a theory by which large aggregations of data by themselves could create potentially the basis for a monopolization case, setting to one side of exclusionary conduct and how that plays out. But this is how it's being discussed. Before we can get into that, I'll allude to this briefly at the end. And what's interesting to me is one of the concerns I have is I dislike the term big data intensely. I love terms that tend to enlighten. I dislike terms that encourage us that obscure, particularly by encouraging us to lump together things without actually thinking about whether there's meaningful differences among them. And one of the things that strikes me is encouraging us, the term big data encourages us to think of all types of data as fungible. If we just count up the number of bits or the size of the storage, then we can actually do an effective analysis. I would like to start talking about the way we should start thinking in a more complex and a more granular way about data that needs to be taken into account to avoid the risk of falling into this pitfall. The other thing is I was really struck by the fact that we'd be looking at an input market, not as a separate input market and a market unto itself, but we'd be looking at terms of its effect on later goods markets or other finished goods markets, particularly in an innovation space. And what we've learned through the years is that, in fact, that's actually a pretty complicated thing to do, but the best example I know, or the best model I know, is the model that Rich was talking about earlier, which is when we think about how innovation is affected by R&D, where the core idea is you have a market where two firms merge, you can analyze it in terms of the concentration at the product market level, but you could also look at it in terms of what it does to the R&D market. And what I find it's really interesting is it found exactly the effects that Rich and Doug were talking about today, but there were some interesting real caveats. He and Steve Sunshine, in all fairness, created a 5-factor set of limitations, which I also think, which were not so much brought up by Rich earlier, and I'd like to explore, because I think that they're quite interesting. They came from a motivation for a particular place that I think was very well taken, and I think that we can learn something about, ask ourselves the question, to what extent those same constraints would affect how we think about data as well. All right. So starting first, when we think about different types of data, one of the interesting distinctions to me is that we really have a tendency to think about all data together. And if you talk to data scientists, they would draw a big distinction between structured data and unstructured data. So structured data is, imagine, you could see this like in a spreadsheet. You have columns and fixed amounts of information, and in fact, it's very discrete, and that's what you process on. And second, structured data is almost always collected specifically to motivate a specific model, and you know how it's all going to play out. And what's quite interesting is when you look at the data science of this, one, the scale you need to do structured data analysis is relatively small. Second, the amount of data, you don't need fancy data science to do this. The tools are relatively well defined, are relatively well understood. And so what we see here is one form of data which has one set of economic characteristics which are very important. On the other hand, the other version is unstructured data. This is if they look at all your photographs, and not knowing anything about what they are, except having some text identification at the end, and you abstract from that different features and actually produce a structure that you superimpose on large amounts of data. This is how large language models work with text. It's often you'll see some social networking sites that are trying to understand. They'll just look at huge amounts of social media feeds or email feeds and try to understand the inherent patterns in them. And in fact, email is often called semi-structured data because if you're analyzing the headers, it's very structured, but if you're looking at the bodies, it's very different, and you might combine the two in some ways that provide insight. So these are polar cases, and there's a spectrum that sits in between. The economic characteristics of unstructured data are very, very different. First, unlike structured, you need a lot more unstructured data to derive what you're getting out of it. And second is, data science is absolutely critical. In fact, what you see is now there have been some wonderful contests between different algorithms where they're actually looking at and seeing how much data they need to create certain levels of fidelity. And they're discovering, in fact, the nature of the algorithms, they perform very differently at the beginning and they cross over. Some do much better at scale. And what we see that, in fact, the choice of algorithm and how you do that becomes very, very important. The other reality is with unstructured data, we tend to do this now in the AI world with neural nets, which is our deep, what we often call deep learning, which requires a lot more data science and a lot more art than science than it does just pure grinding it through. And so what we see here is scale matters, but then again, complementary inputs matter a lot as well for unstructured data. Second, we can't lump them together because the techniques used to analyze each are completely different. You cannot use techniques to analyze structured data and use it for analyzing unstructured data. And so the notion that you somehow bolt these things together and figure out that there's going to be an economic impact just doesn't comport with the way data scientists think about this in terms of reality. And the other problem is when you look at certain data portability and interoperability concerns, I don't even know what that means with unstructured data. I mean, you can make people move things over. To me, there's the great complexity here is one of the mandates of the Digital Markets Act is mandatory data portability. What I always find interesting is as of now, Google and Facebook actually support data portability now. No one uses it. And so there's other obstructions. We'll talk about the fact that you need clients to do it. That may be part of it, and the industry is actually working on doing that. But there's actually problems with the structure of the data and how they move, and in fact, motivating different models creates different problems. A throwaway line you see in the business literature particularly, they talk about 3 Vs, 4 Vs. There's these literatures that talk about 48 Vs and 52 Vs. I don't want to get into the details of them, but they're not really validated by science. But the first V is volume, but they're also talking about velocity, variety, veracity. And in fact, when you see in the AI world, one of the things they're doing is they're actually learning how to get AI models to work better on smaller amounts of higher quality data. And so what we understand is that volume only is part of the picture and is not even necessarily the meaningful way on the basis on which people are now competing. So what we see is that just looking at volume, it doesn't pick up a great deal of, it misses a great deal of other aspects. And then lastly, what we see is it has to motivate business models. If we think about the size of data, we have to understand it relative to e-commerce or search or social media. We could try to make it uniform, but the idea that the scale effects of data in all those radically different industries would be the same would be coincidental in the extreme. I mean, it's just not a logical inference to draw, and what we need to do is not analyze data even in the structured versus unstructured sense, but with respect to particular business models. There's an interesting question that's floating around in my head, and that's not fully developed in the paper. The one thing is, if you think about actually the paying customer for most of these, certainly for search and social media, is advertising. And to some extent, when you're using unstructured data, it tends to motivate the advertising side, not the product delivery side. There may be some commonalities there, and you might be able to do something, but that doesn't really explain e-commerce, where the Amazon business model really doesn't depend on those advertising. Well, they'd like to depend more, but at this point, they're relatively small. And so what you see then is this really interesting idea, but in addition, data can also be used in sort of 3 different ways. It can be a product market in itself. That's the easy case. We have the Arbitron cases, we have a lot of all these other things. If it's a product market or even sold as an input, we have conventional, that's just conventional antitrust. The other interesting question is, if it's an input to an existing product, we have to figure out the relationship between concentration and the market structure of that input market to the final goods market. And the hardest one of all is we're not talking about existing product markets, but innovation, future product markets, developments. We have to have a theory of not how it just, the scale affects the innovative process. And this has always been one of the devils, and and Rich and Doug already teed up the Arrow and Schumpeter as a Herb, and we see a very interesting set of issues floating around in there. Okay, so this is not the first time we've looked at an input market. Rich and Steve Sunshine wrote this wonderful piece in 1995, and it actually proposed thinking about it, about R&D as a separate input into markets. And what we discovered, and the fact pattern is, imagine a 10-firm market. They each have 10% market share, but firm one, the merging firms A and B actually control, say, 90% of the R&D. Should we be concerned? And what you see here is that, in fact, and actually quoting Rich's subsequent work on this, it's been a struggle. It's actually had there's a fair amount of this pre-Genzyme in 2004, but what we see is a relative dearth of cases that rely on this. Katz and Shalansky, I think, had an overview of this. They said they failed to identify a single case based purely on the theory. Sometimes they're thrown in along with it. And what's really interesting is you do see some discussion in guidelines. In the IP licensing guidelines, the current merger guidelines, some other things. And most notably in Europe, you see the Dow DuPont case, where they actually, as most people interpret, as being an example of innovation market case it doesn't actually invoke it, but it really is very similar to that. So there is some of this in the air in trying to understand it. But what I found most cogent about this is that, in fact, Rich's analysis actually identified 5 factors, a 5-part analysis that you had to apply to an innovation market analysis to make sure that it actually did the purposes we're trying to focus with for antitrust. So the first problem is market definition. Having two R&D vendors merge, if they're really in completely different, you can't just count their R&D budgets and say this is a problem. Why? One might be in pharmaceuticals, the other might be in auto manufacturing, it doesn't matter. So in fact, we have to understand when R&D, the two firms' R&D is merging, actually is a reduction in some meaningful form of R&D competition. And so we have to actually figure out that tie. In addition, we have to understand, there's a whole question about the innovation comes from surprising places. It makes it hard and a little bit more speculative. There's another problem of demand and supply substitution, which is, in fact, just because two firms merge, the theory would be they would curtail their R&D activities below optimal levels. And then the question is, would any of the existing players then expand their R&D levels to fill the gap? Would there be alternative sources of this from outside firms and the like? And we have this enormous question. We have to actually do the standard sort of market definition analysis we do typically in mergers. They acknowledge that, in fact, if the downstream market is competitive, by reducing your R&D activity, all you're doing is hurting yourself. And that, in fact, there can be down market competition. And this brings us into an entire line of cases. I always think this Kodak is flashing through my head, which is a whole long conversation. But this is a factor that's identified by Rich and Stephen Sunshine. And they said that, in fact, they point to the Arrow and Schumpeter literature. They're saying we have a problem with drawing, even if we say that merger is happening, inferring what impact it will do on innovation, we don't have great tools. And so this becomes a big issue. And in fact, they acknowledge the possibility of pro-competitive efficiencies. And what you see based on the structure, I skipped it on the previous slide, one of the things that you say at the bottom is that it's in fact had most purchase in pharmaceuticals. The beautiful thing about pharmaceuticals, even if you're pursuing radically different technologies, the timeline is pretty well developed. And in addition, because of clinical trials, you get a long run up at this, and you get a really good look at what the claims they're making, and it actually it's been a relative, if it's flourished anywhere, it's been there. But the problem is the farther we get away from that world, the harder it gets. So what's interesting to me is, I was trying to the next question is, how do we deal with this? If I were to summarize the work of Gilbert and Sunshine, which is always very awkward when Rich is here, but two of the devices that they rely on is one is they really want it to be tied, the R&D to be tied to a specific product, and that involves specialized assets or firm capabilities. And that, in fact, this becomes a way of, instead of just saying, oh, if everything, all R&D competes, then no mergers are possible, everything competes with everything, that can't be right. And so these are two very interesting devices that they assert, and in general have, to the extent to which it's been invoked by in the cases, it had, the guidelines have followed these approaches, and the cases have, with the exception of Dow DuPont. What makes that so interesting is they did not require it be tied to a specific product. And that, if you read the European literature, is regarded as a fairly revolutionary step within European law. But these devices, I think, are very informative. This brings us into Herb's critique of the question is that if you're going to link it to a product, what do you really gain by this? One of the interesting questions is we usually have a 2-year horizon, certainly in mergers. You could say that this will capture things that will get at future products, but the reason it escapes conventional definitions is it's outside the 2-year horizon. The Gilbert and Sunshine initial proposal stayed with 2 years, but one way you could easily amend it is to start to think about these on a longer-term basis. But there's a recognition, even in the original Gilbert and Sunshine work, that the longer you draw this out, the more speculative it becomes. And this becomes harder and harder to do, and it's one of the tensions that sits in the bottom of this. And that, in fact, I realized I didn't go backwards. It's here where it's why it's been limited to pharmaceuticals, because those issues are the least. All right, so let's get to data. So the question then, just very quickly, at a very high level, is that, the question is, are these data used for the same products? I mean, we need to define this. And I would say these are generally what we think of as multi-sided markets or two-sided markets. On the side facing consumers, that is the search aspects of it, I would say that that's a very different use than social media, than e-commerce, and that in fact looking at data without understanding the product markets, what the Gilbert and Sunshine tells us is that it has to be tied to a specific product market to make sure that this ends up in a limited sort of way, in a coordinated sort of way, and that is not something I've often seen in many of the discourses. I think it's a great discipline that I think would improve the analysis. Alternative sources of supply on the unstructured side are much larger. In fact, many of these things are built for advertising profiles. There's some that are very timely, be less so, but some are not very timely at all. It's like your demographic characteristics. There are many sources of alternative sources of that type of information that really don't depend on being in the market. In addition, we see structured data, unstructured data, therefore it's very hard to describe as a specialized asset. Different economies of scale, and there's an empirical literature showing substitution, this is for downward product market competition. Does online advertising compete with traditional advertising? Do different types of online advertising compete with one another? The answer is in the very, very small but existent empirical literature says yes, which suggests that there may be some discipline that. There is some literature exploring scale economies, which is generally finding them relatively modest on the other facing side. And there's really this wonderful notion that data science, particularly on the unstructured side, is an important complementary input. And so what you see that, in fact, when you can substitute more data science for a lack of actual data, you have a much more complex variable proportion situation where it's hard to attribute everything, where you can act, and we buy that talent in an open market, albeit in a very expensive one, but it is an open market. All right. So what I see from this is, what I would say is that a quick note about monopolization cases. One of the things that's interesting is, there's a question of whether this is, exclusionary conduct, but there's a bigger question up front before we even worry about that. How important is the data for these cases? And one of the things that struck me is there was a testimony in the Google case by one of the competitors, a former Google employee, was asked point blank, how much market share do you need to have enough data to actually do these? He said 2.5%. And this isn't the government's case. So, this is a very strange thing that happens. The other thing that's floating around in the Google case, by the way, is whether AI is going to change the structure altogether. Because AI is generally not trained on proprietary data. We know ChatGPT was trained on Reddit data. ChatGPT 3 was trained on Wikipedia data. We don't know what ChatGPT 4 was trained on, but generally the scale is so large, it has to be scraped internet data in the same way as the general assumption. And the interesting question is, first, is they're now using AI to drive search. The question is, when is the data you need to drive search could be changing before our very eyes. Even more importantly, many people are saying people won't search anymore, they're just going to type into AI, in which it's not just an input, changing the way that data is an input into search, it could change the basis of search altogether, where you're actually displacing the competitor altogether. And so we don't know about all this, but it's very interesting, and we have to work this out in monopolization cases, even before we get to the question of if the fact you have a lot of data, because you have operations that have been very successful, have you committed exclusionary conduct that would then trigger monopolization? So in conclusion, I would say that there's some really interesting nuances beyond that would inform sort of the different factors that Doug and Rich presented earlier about that are in dynamic tension. It can be good and can be bad. These are devices created by this work that says to make sure that we harness this analysis for the benefit of consumers. And in fact, we have to look at, in data alternative sources of supply, the uncertainties and the ties to, the uncertainty about the scale of data and its relationship to consumer welfare sticks there very strongly. And in fact, what I say is, data I think are likely to pose bigger problems than R&D. Just because of the prevalence of them and the different aspects of it. And I think that, in fact, there is an empirical literature that's emerging here that can help inform us in ways that I think that have not been thoroughly appreciated yet. And that concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you. It is my pleasure to be here today to discuss big data and competition law lessons from innovation markets. My name is Emily Walden, and I'm a director at NERA Economic Consulting. First, I just wanted to say I think this paper does a really nice job of drawing parallels between big data and innovation markets and allowing us to really harness a lot of the insights that we've gained from our decades of studies of innovation markets to assess what is maybe not new frontiers anymore, but it's certainly more of an emerging area. There's a lot of really good stuff in this paper, and I'm going to focus on two specific areas. So one is the notion that data really can serve many different functions within a market. It can be an end product, it can be an input, or it can be a driver of innovation, which is the focus primarily of this paper. But I want to think a little bit more about kind of the way that data can be both an input and a driver of innovation, and how the line between the two may be blurred in some cases. And so you can think about, as a concrete hypothetical example, you have, an AI chatbot that is tasked with, processing a lot of legal documents and summarizing them and developing those skills in summarizing legal documents. Along the way, they may be evaluating legal documents in a number of different languages, and it may also develop the skill to translate those documents over time. And so the data that was initially used was an input into the product they were offering of legal summarization, but in effect, it actually leads to a new product or an innovation. And so this is a specific example, and I think you need to take it in a very case-specific way, but I think there are instances when data can both be an input and also a driver of innovation. And so thinking about how that impacts the analysis we need to do. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the way that we can harness this empirical literature that was so nicely summarized in the paper to use in practice. And so thinking about all of this data that we have, right? I'm an economist, so I'm going to come at this from an economic standpoint. But we can use that in to evaluate the potential outcome of either a merger or alleged unilateral conduct. And I think one example of a paper that was cited in this article was a paper that looks at the role of data as an input in search engine optimization, and how some empirical studies have actually found that we already have so much data that more data doesn't really even improve the results. And so you could think of a merger involving two search engines. You're looking at their data that they've used historically, and you could look historically at how the data, both the quantity as well as the type of data has actually led to, impacts on the output of their search engine optimization, and that could inform us as to, both what the merging firm would look like post-merger, right? If they're already kind of at economies of scale, and it could also inform what a potential entrant would need to enter the market. So if it looks like they actually, achieved economies of scale at a really small amount of the data they currently have, that I think tells us something about how easy it's going to be for an incumbent to enter. And so I think, there's a lot of potential here now that we have all this data, we have some great empirical studies to actually apply these in specific cases.
I don't really have any comments except to say I appreciate the insight. I think your first one is the stuff. This world rarely sticks in buckets. I mean, there are types that are useful for discourse, but data serves multiple purposes and multiple times, and there's a recursive aspect of this, which makes it particularly hard to deal with. But the empirics, it's funny. I always think of. So most of my early work was almost entirely theoretical, and now I'm doing more and more empirics. And I was struck by Richard Feinberg. Did I have that right? The physicist? Do I have his name? Feynman, thank you. I'm tired. I didn't get much sleep last night. He said two things, he said, this is a false dichotomy. A theory needs empirics needs data, in theory. But he said in a little note, parenthetically, he said, but empirics would do better without theory than theory without empirics. Because his basic point was theory has a harder time surprising itself. And the thing I always think of is there's one of those probes we sent to look at Saturn, I can't remember which one, started going to the outer solar system, and they found this enormous gas cloud out there that nobody knew existed. And now the theorists are off and running again, but they needed sometimes surprises to have new things to study. And so I find that occasionally, even just routing around empirics can create these wonderful puzzles for us and phenomena that we have to explain. And so I think there's a natural dialogue between the two, but empirics sometimes is the big driver of us to really push theory forward in ways that are very positive. And so I think mining the empirical literature is critical, because otherwise anything you can argue in theory is viable, and anything you can argue virtually anything in theory. We have 3 minutes. Do you want questions or not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have much to add to that, because that all, I think is all right? That there's this interplay between theory and empirics, and I think, as you really nicely put in your presentation here today and in the article, data, this is really complicated, right? And so theory tends to simplify things, and it, works nicely maybe in the case where, I just talked about where you have a search engine optimization. That data is pretty simple, right? In terms of some of the data we're talking about these days. And so, what actually, ends up happening in practice is going to be really industry specific. There's going to be different, potential implications for different industries, for different types of data, like structured and unstructured data. And I think a lot of that's going to play out in actually what we see in the data, on the data. And I think there's a lot of exciting research that's come out recently, but there's certainly a lot more to be done as well.